Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video. I hope that you're all doing well. Today we're going to be talking about And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is going to be a spoiler-free review, so if you're thinking about reading it and you haven't read it yet, do not worry, there will not be any spoilers. I've split this review into 4 parts, a quick publication history of the novel, a quick plot summary, like I said, no spoilers, 3 kind of like thoughts of the novel, the main part of the review, and 4, I thought I'd kind of incorporate this into my Agatha Christie rankings and see how it lines up against some of her other best work. So let's make a start. And Then There Were None was published in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. I believe it's Agatha Christie's best-selling novel at around 100 million copies, which is just insane. This was published in the same year as Murder is Easy, which I also really like. This was published, like her other novels, as part of the Collins Crime Club. And this is a standalone novel, so it's not part of a series. Poirot and Miss Marple do not pop up in this. It exists on its own. The edition that I have is the facsimile editions, which I don't think you can get hold of anymore. I think that they're out of print, but this is the original cover. I love these editions. I think that they're absolutely fantastic. Without going off into a tangent, I did want to mention that this book does have a somewhat checkered publication history. It has been renamed twice in the UK since publication, I believe. What I'll do below is link down to one of my favourite podcasts. It's called the She Done It podcast. It's a podcast about golden age crime. If like me, you love golden age crime, you don't want to give it a listen. But the episode I'm going to list down below is an episode focused on editing Agatha Christie in general, not specific to this novel, but it's a really interesting podcast episode, and it throws up how subjective and kind of complex the editing process can be. Like I said, this novel has been renamed twice because the 2 previous titles contained racial slurs. There's something to be aware of. Obviously now we know it as And Then There Were None. Next up, I'll just quickly set up the plot. First of all, I wanted to say that if you've read this, you'll be familiar, but the plotting for this is like 10 out of 10. She's done such an incredible job, and one of the things that I love about this book is that stylistically this is quite a simple read. However, the plotting of this is so intricate and so well developed to make this work. So plot mechanics for this one, in terms of other crime novels, I cannot tell you how highly I rate this. But let's jump into the plot and I'll quickly set it up. No spoilers, like I said. All of everything I'm about to describe kind of happens in the first 30 pages or so. So this is from, I believe, the introduction to And Then There Were None in current editions is taken from Agatha Christie's autobiography, and she writes this. I had written this book because it was so difficult to do that the idea had fascinated me. 10 people had to die without it becoming ridiculous or the murderer being obvious. I wrote the book after a tremendous amount of planning, and I was pleased with what I had made of it. It was clear, straightforward, baffling, it certainly is, and yet it had a perfectly reasonable explanation. That's a really good account of just how simplistic and yet complex this novel is. In this novel, the very beginning, when you start reading, you have 10 strangers, and then those 10 strangers have either been invited, hired, or paid to go to an island called Soldier Island off the coast of Devon. As the novel opens, we are introduced to all 10 of them. They're all travelling down. Soldier Island is a isolated, quite barren island. It has really sharp kind of cliff slopes. It is liable to be cut off in bad weather, which will become very important. And on this island, a multimillionaire has previously built a state-of-the-art, very modern mansion. And this mansion, we learn at the very beginning of the novel, has been sold on to a Mr. U.N. Owen. We only know his names, we don't know any more details about him. So the 10 strangers that we have travelling down to Devon appear to be completely randomly selected. They don't know each other. As an example, you have a Mr. Justice Wargrave, who is a recently retired judge. We have a Harley Street doctor, a secretary, Vera Claythorne, a First World War general. You get the gist. They're all from different parts of society, and when we meet them, they're travelling down to Devon to go on to Soldier Island by boat. The 10 arrive on the island, and the island is duly cut off by a storm from the mainland. Mr. UN Owen never arrives, and they very quickly realise that they are in a trap, essentially. An announcement is made via gramophone that all 10 of our characters are guilty of murder, and this is one of the main themes of the book. Is these 10 characters are all guilty of murder, but not the type of murder that can be prosecuted in a court of law. So a really good example of this is 2 of our characters, Mr. Rogers the butler and his wife. They are charged by Mr. UN Owen with withholding medication from an elderly lady that they worked for. She was dependent on this medication, without which she would die. And at the crucial moment, they didn't administer the medication. They stood to benefit from her will, but that couldn't be proved as murder in the late 1930s. So it's a crime kind of committed outside of the law. There's also an example of the Harley Street doctor that I mentioned, who carried out surgery, a fairly routine surgery on a patient. He was drunk while doing it, and she died of malpractice. Again, not provable. It was never kind of proved that anything had happened, and so he got away with murder. But you quickly learn that all of these 10 people are not very pleasant people. They've all done something really quite terrible. But I would say that the novel does differentiate between the degrees of guilt. And one of the really interesting things about this is how the murderer goes about exacting justice on the 10 people and in what order. So our 10 guests are on the island. In each of their bedrooms is a framed nursery rhyme called 10 Little Soldiers. And the book, and this is so clever of Agatha Christie, this nursery rhyme is interwoven. Agatha Christie does this with other of her crime novels, but not as well as I think as she does it in And Then There Were None. This is the way she's done this is absolutely perfect. So as an example, the first part of the nursery rhyme starts as 10 little soldier boys went out to die. One choked his little self, and then there were none. I won't go into any more plot than that because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read it. But if you haven't read it, you're in for such an enjoyable ride. One of the criticisms that Agatha Christie gets a lot, and I think it's unfair, it's kind of levelled against her, that her novels are not especially well written, that they're overly simplistic. And I would say that stylistically this is a very simplistic novel. However, psychologically and in terms of the plotting and the plot mechanics, this is actually a really complex novel. I can imagine just how hard it was to plan out this novel, to work through how this would all work, to make sure that there aren't any holes in the plot. That must have been an incredibly difficult job. It's truly, in terms of the whodunit, I think a work of absolute genius. And yes, perhaps the writing is simple, but I do think within the context of a mystery novel that is bang on the money. Next up, let's just talk through some thoughts about the novel. If you've read And Then There Were None, I would love to hear your thoughts too. Obviously, it's a really popular one, but again, no spoilers, but I just wanted to talk through what I kind of think of this. So first off, one of the things that I think is really distinct about this novel is that this isn't a puzzle murder mystery like a lot of her other novels. So you don't really get clues threaded in along the way. Is it possible to work out who the murderer is? Potentially, but actually I think no. The resolution is quite simple. This is, I think, as close as Agatha Christie gets to a thriller. This is more psychological. It's more about a increasing sense of foreboding. It's very sinister, more about the character's psychology than it is about solving the puzzle. I'm very good at guessing murderers in crime novels. I've read an awful lot of crime. I've read maybe, I think, about 20 or 30 Agatha Christie's. I haven't read them all yet, although that is something that I'm planning to do over the course of like the next few years. But this I absolutely didn't get, and I remember the first time that I read it in like 2014, maybe 2015. The revelation in this absolutely blew me away. If you did guess who this was, I would be very impressed, so like do let me know. I cannot remember where I heard this. It may well have been on a podcast about Agatha Christie, but one of the things that was mentioned is that Agatha Christie is the perfect combination between the mundane on one hand and the menacing on the other. And there are just a few moments in this that perfectly encapsulate that. There's one quote from Vera Claythorne, who is the secretary who's on the island, and by this point, people have been killed. There are like dead bodies in the house. And this is the quote: Vera moved to the tea table. There was a cheerful ratter and clink of china. Normality returned. Tea. Bless ordinary, everyday afternoon tea. Essentially just a group of people who are terrified. They know that they're in a trap. They know that they're being hunted and that the plan is to kill them one by one. And yet, everyday things still have to carry on. Another example of this is, and I think 4 people have been killed by this point, but our remaining kind of 6 characters are at breakfast essentially, and the quote is, "Who'll have the last egg? Marmalade? Thanks, can I cut you some bread?" 6 people behaving normally at breakfast. And it's this combination, and you get this in all of her novels, of kind of murder, but then just people carrying on and going about their lives and kind of resolving to maintain manners and kindness and order in life. I love that about her novels. The standout thing for me about this novel is the sense of atmosphere, just how sinister and eerie and creepy this novel actually is. That is, I think, what makes this an absolute success as a crime novel. This novel is also really focused on the psychology of the characters. There comes a big turning point in the novel when the characters have realised that people are being murdered, as opposed to the first couple of murders just being coincidences. They search the island. Again, this happens in really early on in the book, but they search the island and they realise nobody is there. And the big realisation comes when they realise that Mr. UN Owen, or Mr. Unknown, is actually one of them. And again, I'll quote from the novel: "Given the scheme in question, which is neither more nor less than the execution of justice upon certain individuals for offences which the law cannot touch, there is only one way in which that scheme could be accomplished. Mr. Owen could only come to the island in one way. It's perfectly clear that Mr. Owen is one of us." That speech is given by Justice Wargrave, and it really is a big turning point, because when they realise that the killer is among them and that they're all in danger from each other, that's so sinister, and that is really the stuff of nightmares. And I think that that's why this novel carries so much weight. Everybody in this novel is a potential victim, but also a suspect. And so what you have is this atmosphere of paranoia just descend on everybody. They're constantly second guessing each other's actions, motives, what has previously been said. And all of the characters react to this realization that the killer is among them, is one of them, in different ways. There is one character who becomes quite resigned to the fact that they're going to die. Some of the characters become quite hysterical and kind of start to lose their minds. Some of them kind of are really intent on action and discovering who it is. I guess the big question is where does this fall in terms of Agatha Christie's work? I don't think that there's much disagreement, and I certainly don't disagree that this is one of her best novels. It's certainly one of the best-selling ones, but I think in terms of the themes, the psychology, the atmosphere, the place, the plotting, it's really high up. The way that it fits into my ranking is that I have like a group of like 5-ish favourites, and then there were none. Murder on the Orient Express, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, The ABC Murders, Crooked House. I think that's about it. I think that they're my favourites. I would rank this generally about 3 or 4. I think The Murder on the Orient Express and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd are two of the best, and like this ones, they have a big reveal. What I will say about this is that the plot for this one isn't absolutely watertight. If you're looking for it, if you're picking it apart, I guess you could spot a few little holes kind of in the plot. That doesn't bother me at all, because I think that in terms of substance, this more than makes up for it. But yeah, I think for my rankings, I would put this kind of 3 or 4. There are a lot of adaptations of this. There's a 2015 BBC, I think, miniseries that's absolutely fantastic, that I think really gets the atmosphere of this. It's very sinister, it's very airy, it's very creepy. That has Charles Dance in it. The guy from Poldark is in it. I have read a fair amount of Agatha Christie, I'd say about 20 or 30, but when I first started reading her, I read them out of order. I just got whatever I could get my hands on. You can always get copies of her like secondhand, or whenever you go to like a holiday cottage, they always have a good Agatha Christie. And then a couple of years ago, I started a very long term project to read her novels in series order. And so I think I'm about 5 Poirot's in, I'm about 6 Miss Marples in, and then I'm just kind of going to the standalone novels one by one. I reread this one this week for this review, but I am thinking actually that I'd quite like to do them all collectively in chronological order. But I'll have to have a little think about that, but you'll definitely see more Agatha Christie's popping up. That's it from me. I would love to hear your thoughts on And Then There Were None. If you've read it, if you want to read it, or kind of where this falls in your Agatha Christie rankings. That's it. I hope that you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will see you in the next video on Friday, which is going to be a bookish update from me of a few kind of favourite book-ish favourites, which one of which is a new Kobo that I have. So yep, I will see you all on Friday. Have a lovely week.